me, but if you don't, my name is Greg Taylor. I'm a fish biologist for the Corps. I've worked for the Corps since 2001. And it's been a busy year for the Corps of Engineers. Always is. We've spent a lot of time working on turbid water coming out of a couple of the reservoirs in the Middle Fork and in the South Santiam basins. It's been a big deal. Yeah, I wish I had a microphone because I don't project super well, but I'll try.
Or stand closer to us.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time working on drawdown related issues, and they go way beyond fish. And in fact, fish is a tiny part of it at the end of the day. The issues that we've been working this year mostly are around drinking water impacts. And that's been a really significant issue. And it's taken, as it should, a tremendous amount of time and effort to work through that, to put a process in place that we could work with cities and understand their impacts and then make decisions around whether to carry forward some of those operations or not. And in this year, you saw us get to a target elevation at Green Peter for an operation and then actually stop that operation. And if you didn't read about it, what happened there, the city of Sweet Home's water filtration plant has, I've become an expert at drinking water, has 3 filtration systems. One of them blew up, guys. And that's not hyperbole. It blew up. And when it blew up, it put them in jeopardy to even be able to deliver water to their citizens. So all that's a way of kind of introducing, and I think what this group, I've always appreciated about this group understands the complexities of trying to operate the dams that society built and envisioned really 100 years ago in today's modern world, which kind of continues to evolve. And so that's been, that can be real challenging. And I think you know some of the things that we're doing related to those drawdowns were the direct result of litigation. That will continue to be the case. And we just got to do our best to kind of balance all those things that we're trying to do. So what I have pictured for you up here is a screenshot of a half of one page of a 670-page document. That 670-page document is the Corps of Engineers' biological opinion. So what the heck is that, and what does it mean? So here's what it means. When a federal agency takes an action and it has a potential impact on a fish or any other species that's listed on the Endangered Species Act, they need to go through a process to evaluate the effect of that action on the endangered species. So long story short, the end of that process, the entities that administer the Federal Endangered Species Act for the federal government, and on the fish side, it's typically National Marine Fisheries Service for things like salmon and steelhead, and for something like a bull trout, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They author a document. It's called the biological opinion. It's got a whole bunch of information in it, but somewhere in there is a set of actions that the federal government is required to take to meet their requirements under the Endangered Species Act. That's Greg's version of a very complicated ESA process. But we have that 670-page document. We got that back on, well, it actually hit the street, I think, on the 26th of December. We got it in our office on the 30th. That was also an outcome of litigation. One of the requirements we had of this litigation that occurred back in 2018 was to essentially reconsult on the operations of the Willamette project. And that needed to be completed by the 31st of December 2024. So beat the clock by 4 days or 1 day, depending on how you count it. It's done. There's a whole bunch in there. What I put up here is just some of the big picture structural improvements that are contemplated in that buyout. The federal government and the Corps of Engineers is contemplating somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 to $3 billion worth of fish work in the Willamette associated with the Willamette project under this buyout. Let that sink in. Yeah. Like, that's a lot of money. And it is going to be a real challenge on a number of fronts. In a previous buyout, 2008, we had several of these same items. We did not receive funding for some of the big picture items that people place a lot of value on. Some of the downstream passage structures that are really the ones at the end of the day that are going to kind of drive some real improvement potentially in the status of these species. So we got some real challenges. We certainly learned a lot in the previous go-round. Certainly doing a ton of work to try to align people all the way up to make sure that the resources are in place. If the resources aren't in place, none of this will happen. If none of this happens, we'll be sued. Even if it does happen, we'll probably be sued. That's probably the one thing you can guarantee. We're going to be sued. But we're working on it. And so in your basin, what was identified in the buyout is a multi-phased project to look at downstream passage at Cougar. And what that looks like is what I'll call a hybrid operational and structural modification of the dam. So what I mean by that, a structural modification would be building a downstream passage facility that would sit in the reservoir and move up and down with the reservoir. An operational alternative would be spill a bunch of water through an existing dam or spillway gate that's already there. What's contemplated here is a drawdown of Cougar Reservoir that would be pretty much permanent. It would have the structural component would be likely a new intake in the reservoir somewhere, but using the diversion tunnel long term as the route for fish downstream with a much reduced reservoir footprint. There are 1,000 complications around that. I won't bore you with all those details, but there are multiple phases to kind of walk through the process to evaluate whether that can happen or not happen from a whole bunch of sides of that equation. If it did happen, I think the date to focus in on would be 2033 is when it's envisioned that would be in place and rolling permanently.
The drawdown?
The drawdown, everything envisioned around the drawdown, including the infrastructure, and away you go.
Last year we talked about different elevations of drawdown in the reservoir and what each of those elevations might mean in terms of sediment moving out of the reservoir bed and downstream to the South Park and the stuff. So can you talk about what elevations we might be looking at?
Yeah, so what's envisioned here is significantly lower than any elevation that was achieved during the construction of the tower in 2002 through to 2005.
Yeah.
So in that year, the first year, I think we got as low as 1375, but then most of the subsequent years, I think we were more in the 1425 range at Cougar, maybe even a little bit higher. Actually, it was probably higher than that. Yeah, 1450. Cougar's got some real complications just because of just the physical layout of where the intake sits and what's called a saddle dam that isolates that intake from the rest of the reservoir. If that wasn't there, things would be a lot less complicated than they are. But it is there. So it really does complicate it. So Ethan, it's not a stream bed drawdown, but it's damn close. There's going to be a very small residual pool.
And this again would be 2032, that would be
Yeah, it would be, yeah, it says here up and rolling by 2033. Now, there are things here you don't see which require us to do some testing of the diversion tunnel. There's not, just to be fair, there's not a lot of detail around that, other than we're supposed to work with NOAA to figure out what that looks like. I'll tell you this, testing the diversion tunnel with 200 feet ahead on it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense to just shove fish down 200, and we know what that's going to do.
Yeah.
Well, you're already doing it.
So, well, we're not using the diversion tunnel at
Oh,
all.
you're just dropping them over the edge of the dam.
No, we're putting them through the RO,
Yeah.
which would be a whole different thing. So this is trying to test that. My point is that you get what I'm saying here. You'd have to draw the pool down to test the diversion tunnel in any meaningful way. So I don't know what that's going to look like. That occurs much earlier in this process than this, if it actually plays out.
So do you think that you guys would need to draw the reservoir down low enough where it will start moving sediment to test the tunnel?
Yeah, we'd have to recut. So the way this works is, and you know, we've learned even more over the years of doing a lot of these drawdowns now. There's a distinction here. This is still technically what I would consider a partial reservoir drawdown, meaning there's still a reservoir there. That turns out to make a huge difference in what you see in terms of the sediment downstream, the sediment load. So at Fall Creek, where we do the stream bed drawdown, it's nothing for the channel to fill in by 7, 8, 10 feet of sediment. Like the whole channel. And then after the first high flow, it's gone again. You don't see that with these partial reservoir drawdowns. You didn't see it at Cougar. You don't see it at Green Peter or Lookout. Now Detroit is going to be drawn down as well under this buyout. And what you do see is turbid water. And you see a high amount of turbidity. Only the finest material, think about this, anything that passes downstream of that dam presumably has had to migrate through essentially a stagnant reservoir of some size. So it's only the stuff that's the fine material that actually makes it through there and then downstream. You don't see the sands and gravels and, you know, some of the beneficial stuff if you were actually
Yeah.
passing it downstream.
That's right.
You just see this really fine stuff.
Also known as DDT.
Well, DDT is in some places, it's not in others. We never documented it in the water downstream of Cougar. I know nobody in this group believes that. We did test it. it is, I can tell you it was in its highest concentrations in the Forest Duff. Like out of the water, which is really scary if you pick mushrooms or do anything up there. Testing is going to be required in all these places, and that is a residual issue up there. It's interesting to me where we find some of this stuff and where we don't. Like, if you were to guess DDT at Fern Ridge versus South Fork McKenzie, what would you guess?
High.
Well, yeah, and that's not what happened. Like, Fern Ridge is relatively clean DDT-wise in comparison to the area above Cougar Dam. And yet Green Peter, some of these places, we're not getting hits for those kind of things either. So that is something that absolutely will have to be worked through in this case. Whether it can be, I don't know. I will tell you there's a lot of dam safety issues and concerns, period, around this. And that's a big part of that early part of the process is evaluating that. And I think, well, I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. So we'll go through that process.
So what's different about Blue River?
There's very little or anything contemplated for Blue River in terms of the biop itself. I don't know if I answered your question, Ken. Was that your question?
I don't,
Why is it not being?
yeah, why isn't it being considered? Is there a particular difference there, or?
Yeah, well, I think the primary difference is if you go back and just look at kind of the history there. Obviously, there was Chinook use of that drainage, but there was also a natural barrier it's buried now in the reservoir.
Looking what falls.
So there wasn't a lot of use of the area in the upper part of that watershed, at least historically. And so it's never been a big player in this process because it's been viewed as a relatively minor contributor, I guess. So there's no specific item associated with, say, reestablishing fish above Blue River.
So the mitigation for Cougar and Blue River from the Corps of Engineers was for 4,000 Chinook because of Cougar, 60 Chinook because of Blue River.
Mhm.
So that, it wasn't a giant
Yeah,
player in the.
I just never heard the discussion before, so.
Yeah, that's the main reason. I will tell you that there has been some consideration for that in the past, like just because, if you could think of the scenario where you could improve the status of the fish species in this basin, period. Maybe that's a play. If you could reliably produce 1,000 Chinook that were returning to Blue River, that would lift the whole population up, right? So it's absolutely been thought about and considered, but I think the only way that would really play out is if you did a Fall Creek style full stream bed drawdown at that site. And in fact, they did some of that in the early 90s, and there was some poking around and some thoughts around that.
But to achieve that, you'd have to remove that saddle dam, is that what you're saying?
That's
Yeah.
in Cougar.
So
Drop the
so at Cougar,
level, yeah.
what happens at Cougar is all the water goes through the intake tower
Yeah.
until you get down to a certain elevation in the reservoir.
Yeah,
And once you get down to about 1,500 in that reservoir,
1485.
yes, it drops. I rounded up by 15 feet. It drops below that saddle dam.
Yeah.
And then literally, the only way to pass water out is through the diversion tunnel.
Yeah.
So that's
If you
just a
remove the
unique.
saddle dam.
You could remove the saddle dam. I've asked
Whoa.
people about that. You know what they
We
said?
got guys in this.
Quit talking
room that
about
will do
removing the
that
saddle
twice.
dam.
Yeah.
You're gonna mess with the dam.
Greg, as I read the BIOP,
You've probably read more of it than I have, to be fair. I've just been talking about it the whole time.
as, my sense was the BIOP had two major reservations. One, whether the diversion tunnel could be operated safely from a sediment standpoint. And secondly, that Congress would have to clarify the intent, because with the water, basically run-of-the-river approach, the whole purpose for the dam would be changed, and it would require implementation through some act of Congress to clarify
Wow.
a new role. And they seemed skeptical, and that moved them back to the regulating openings.
So the way the Corps, I think handled is probably the nicest word. We had to demonstrate that we could continue to produce hydropower there. For the reason you just described. So what we did is we modeled it. What that showed us is that if we went down to elevation, I think it was 1340, which makes no sense to me because there's basically no water below that. I mean, there's probably 500 acre feet. But at that elevation, we technically, in the period of record, which is like 80 years, we could have produced hydropower for at least one day.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? I mean, you're for, you've played this game before. And so that met that criteria. Now, if we go back, that will be one of the things we look at, Steve, because one of the things we're going to look at, and you're probably aware of the Waterland, well, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. On January 5th of this year, we received some Water Resource Development Act language that says the Corps of Engineers now has to go back and look at a no hydropower alternative across the entire Willamette Basin. Now, I want to clarify this because I think the reporting's been pretty poor. As an alternative, before we can complete our consultation process. So I just told you we have a biological opinion. We do. What we don't have is an environmental impact statement and a record of decision. And we won't have it until we finish that process. We don't know what that means right now. We're trying to determine what that language means for us. We have previously submitted a report to Congress that actually looks at that issue. To be fair, that report's never seen the light of day. It could be as simple as using that. It could be, we could take years to go back and evaluate this under the EIS. What that would mean is we would not have a ROD. Technically, we wouldn't be required to implement the BIOP then under that. We might be living under the injunction still.
That's where my thought was.
So anything that's in the new BIOP, but not under the injunction, might actually fall off the table until that process plays out. There is some irony there because some of the folks that really push for that language really want to see a whole bunch of things happen that actually wouldn't happen. So let me give you an example. The drawdown at Detroit. It's not in the injunction, but it is in the BIOP. And so depending on what happens with the word of language, we may or may not actually end up drawing Detroit down this year. We don't know yet. We're still trying to figure all that out. It's super complicated.
In 2023, we saw like pretty high sediment in the Norfolk Willamette, below Lookout. But this past year, 2024, we kind of saw high water on average without sediment, and then no real sediment later in the year when we saw it in 2023.
Yeah.
Like what caused that and, why?
Yeah, so one of the things that I had classic government speak when I go out and talk to people. I answer a question without answering the question. So on that topic, the way I was phrasing it was, well, we expect to see the duration of turbidity come down and the magnitude of turbidity come down over time. So in other words, I just told you it's going to change over time, but I didn't tell you anything actually. I mean, I didn't know exactly how it was going to happen. Because I didn't. So Ethan asked me this year, he said, hey, I got a business. Like, I'm trying to figure out whether I should be down there or not. I said, dude, you better be off the water by the 30th of December, or of September. Because after that, I have no idea. Well, that didn't play out that way. And so what has happened is the river did a hell of a lot more work than we thought it would do. And so basically where this turbidity comes from is multiple sources, right? But one of the biggest sources in the first year is when that reservoir transitions back to river. And in the case of Lookout, you had about 5 to 7 miles of reservoir that had been reservoir for 70 years, had to transition back to a river. And if you've walked out there in that drawdown, it was like a sandbox. And so that river was recutting that channel. And so I was out there a lot last year on my personal time and this year. I was stunned. The first year, it was exactly what you'd expect. It was mud and turbid water. It was clear, guys. I mean, it was running through that channel. It just cleared that channel out. It's amazing. And so we saw a dramatic reduction in the amount of turbidity this year. Still had turbidity. It was still turbid, but the magnitude was way down. And then the duration of that turbidity was down too. So that was a really good sign. That's what we expect to see long term. It's just, it was hard to know how quickly that was going to play out. Saw the same thing at Green Peter this year. But there's still turbid water there. And so that one, I think, we were starting at a higher place at Green Peter. and there's a lot more sediment in that reservoir. It's a lot more complex. It's got two, large tributaries to the reservoir. So there's a lot more going on at Green Peter than Lookout. But anyway, it's come down. It's great. I think next year will be even better. There's theoretically a point in time where you're going to see little to no turbidity if you keep going to that same set point. And that's what we hoped would happen. It just, we couldn't communicate this to folks because we can't predict it. I mean, we have a ton of sophisticated turbidity modeling. They don't worth a shit. I mean, you can't, it's too hard to do, even though people tried to do it. It's just not predictive enough. So people took a shot at it. I'm glad it kind of surprised to the upside this year. And hopefully that trend continues.
Yeah, Greg, just, somebody asked me what I thought would happen. I'd say, for Cougar, I'd say be prepared to live under the Hernandez injunction for the foreseeable future. What would that mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at Cougar, what that would mean is that we would continue to do two things that are the primary things we're doing at Cougar. One is one that you don't even notice goes on, which is we do a 27-foot drawdown from the minimum conservation pool. Why 27 feet? Well, what we've just been talking about. If you go below that, you're going to isolate the rest of the reservoir from the intake tower. Okay, so basically we take it down as low as we can, still have some intake tower water. That gives the fish a nice surface route out, or a relatively shallow surface route out. If you drop below there, now again, the diversion tunnel is your outlet. To really get those fish out, you have to draw the pool way down. So we're just going to have that 27-foot drawdown in place. Nobody knows it's even happening. We have exclusive use of the regulating outlet is part of that drawdown. And this drawdown is November 15th through December 15th. And then we are doing what's called a delayed refill as well there. So what that looks like is we're keeping the pool down on February 1st instead of filling it. Just below the minimum conservation pool. It's only 12 feet. Don't ask me why, even though I was there. There's nothing magic about that. But, and then that gets held, and then the pool eventually comes up and accumulates just enough water to essentially operate the temperature control tower itself, which is not a huge amount of water. So for instance, at 1532, you need to get up in the 1590s, 1600s. So about 60, 70 feet of water to really have enough water to operate all summer long with the temperature control tower. So that's what it'll look like.
So we've had about 3 years of this. Is there any indication that we have improved downstream survival? That this is working, what you just outlined?
Yeah.
Is an improvement in juvenile survival?
I would say we're probably doing a little bit better at getting fish out in that the window in the wintertime. Anytime you narrow up the depth to the intake, theoretically you're going to get more fish out. Now that can be influenced by a lot of things like flow as well. So that's always a good thing. So I think it's been good. That has been good. It also condenses those fish into a smaller area. They theoretically have an easier time finding the outlet itself. So I think all that's been good. The numbers are always complicated, Steve. It's almost impossible to look at the individual numbers, and especially when you're using screw traps as your monitoring tool, to say, man, that's working. My sense is that we're seeing some pretty good numbers, especially early on when we do the drawdown, and so I think that's been a positive. The delayed refill is a little bit, I would say, more ambiguous. The idea behind the delayed refill is to keep, again, that depth to the intake pretty low, but you're targeting a different group of fish. You're targeting the fry that have just come into the reservoir. Well, the thing that hurts us in the South Fork is the same thing that helps us in the South Fork. The thing that helps us in the South Fork, it's got this amazing cold water, right? But what does that mean? The fish come out later. So they're coming into the reservoir later. It's harder to get them to find their way out because they're not in there as long and they're not as big. Is if we were doing a delayed refill over at Fall Creek, the fish are in the reservoir months earlier because it's inherently warmer. They're larger. They're going to probably benefit from that a little bit more. We have seen some fish come out, but the numbers have been pretty small under the delayed refill. So I'm calling it a mixed bag at this point. I think that drawdown is the smart thing to do. It's not having any real negative impacts, and yet it's kind of the best we can do with what we have. So we should be doing that, and hopefully that's what we'll keep doing for now.
When did they start trapping the adult migrating anadromous fish and putting those out the reservoir?
Well, for the first time, so
93 we
there's
started.
a long story there. Yeah, they obviously had, actually, believe it or not, a facility in place when the dam was constructed. Fish didn't come back to it. There's a long story there, primarily because the water was too cold. But in modern times, yeah, it was in the early to mid 90s.
And that was when they installed the screw trap and then started trucking?
No.
Yeah, the screw traps were in there for the first time, I think, in 97. I started in 98 and started.
Isn't that basically what started this whole kind of cascade of issues? Was, I mean, what was the impetus to getting the fish above the dam in the first place? Was there a lawsuit that sparked that?
Nope. No, I think there's two primary drivers. One is just the general recognition by biologists that those fish play an important role in the ecosystem, and that they needed to be up there. And so something like a bull trout that lives off of, in part, little juvenile spring Chinook salmon, that's a pretty key thing to have around. And so that drove, at least in one of the basins, that idea. I think the one that was the big driver, though, was the listing in 1999. And what I tell everybody is, look, we've already got fish below the dams, and that's performing however it's performing. We got a group of fish that we've been putting above the dams for a long time, but not everything's in place to make that successful. The reality is, if you want to improve the numbers of wild fish in this basin, you've got to get the fish sustaining themselves in the habitat that's available above the dams. Because in most basins, that is the lion's share of the historic habitat that was there. And so that's the goal. It is a tremendous challenge. It is not certain to work or occur long term. But it's also the thing that you got to do if you're going to improve the status. If you don't give a crap about the status, you can just leave them below the dams and let them be, and they'll do something. But really, realistically, in this basin, you've got to use those areas above the dams. It's just a tremendous challenge. So it was the listing that really, really drove it, even though there was a recognition by at least one person in this room that, having those fish up there is also really important for ecological reasons. And they're both.
Did you resurface the face of the dam below the regulating outlet so the survival was better?
We did.
And?
I haven't seen that number. I don't know what it says. I was a bit of a skeptic, I gotta be honest, about that. Even though there was some pretty good data that suggests that the fish that used the regulating outlet were contacting it. It was the right thing to do, smart thing to try. I was never of the thought that that was going to be a huge uplift, in part because I didn't think it was the primary reason the fish were suffering the mortality. We'll see. At the same time, we're also modifying the regulating outlet. I was just telling Jeff, I'm a little disconnected from that. All my work with drinking water and everything else, I've got a little disconnected from what we're doing there. But there's an additional modification to the RO that's coming beyond recoating the surface that might be more impactful, might not.
A Velcro or a slick surface
It's
Slippery slide.
slip.
Yeah, and a gentler slide,
Yeah.
maybe.
Is there any thought into downstream accounting of success in these outbound smolt after they've gone through these dams?
Yeah, so a big part of this BIOP that's not on that chart is a research monitoring and evaluation program. There's an extensive one, I'm guessing it'll be, I don't know. It's been in the range of $10 million annually recently. This presumably will be more than that. It's got all kinds of things that are being considered. One of them, as you could imagine, that's a real high priority is trying to get a better sense of survival of some of the outmigrating smolts in the system. That's contemplated primarily through the use of potentially pit tags. There's some complications around that, but it's being contemplated. I do think it's hurt this basin, in my opinion, to not have a basin-wide, like, smoke monitoring program that's in place, but it is being contemplated. I think the Corps looks at it a little differently, to be fair. I think the Corps looks at it like, hey, let's evaluate fish moving through our facilities, and it's good to know what they do when they leave, but we can't be wholly responsible for that either. So it's something we'll work with the whole region on to figure out what makes sense and kind of how to attack it.
It just seems like it would be a way to be able to say, hey, this is working sooner than waiting 3 to 5 years for an adult family to return.
Agree, and it also might tell you why or why not you're not seeing some of the things you might not see. Right now, probably the best tool in the basin is the genetics that we're using to do these pedigree analyses and reassign adults back to, or attempt to reassign returning adults back to fish that would have spawned above the dams. That has given us the most holistic look at big picture, how that group of fish is performing. What it doesn't do is tell you anything about the sources of mortality. And so if you're at 20% replacement on a group of fish you put above the dam, well, why? It could be something at the dam, it could be something not at the dam, could be likely both, right? So it is good to have that whole picture. I do think again, the Corps, it gets a bit complicated because they try to put some bounds on how much work they're doing everywhere.
Not to open too big a can of worms, I hope. But what's the discussion within the Corps about potentially just breaching a lot of these dams by getting rid of it?
Reaching them.
Like we've seen on the plans.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question. How much infrastructure is on our floodplain in the Willamette?
And when you're not required to draw them down for fish passage, they're still being used as flood control. So all of them. Right.
So I think the fair way to have this conversation is to look at what have the other dam removals told us about the process of getting to the point of where you would remove a dam. And from where I sit, those dams in the Pacific Northwest all follow a really predictable playbook. Private owner, expired FERC license. Because they have to go get a new FERC license, now that's a federal process. They're exposed to the Endangered Species Act. There are endangered species present. There are a process to walk through, and you contemplate and consult on what needs to be done now that these endangered species are there. And turns out it's really costly. Private entity says, dang, this doesn't make any sense. Out comes a dam. Every one of them.
Yeah.
Elwha,
Right.
Klamath,
White salmon.
white salmon, marmot, all follow that exact playbook to a T. And so this is not some environmental ethic, it's not it's money. And our dams don't follow that playbook. We don't have a federal license to operate. And those dams didn't have a bunch of those other authorized purposes. They don't have things that they were doing. And so I just put ours in a different category.
Right.
Other people don't. I don't think that's real. I don't think it's even, I think it's just absolute moonshot crazy shit, quite frankly. It just makes no sense in this basin. Will they continue, and to be fair, will they continue to evolve in how the water's managed? Yes. Yes. And the trend has been what? The trend has been to keep less water in storage for a longer period of time. That's been the trend. I think we're still heading that direction. I'm not sure how much further it's going to go, but if you read the papers, there are people that would like to drain all the dams and keep them all dry, and there are people that don't. So, but society needs to figure all that out, and then they can let us know, and then we'll do whatever we need to do.
Brilliant.
Or yell at us the whole time while we're trying to figure it out.
So, it sounds like the floating collection device is off the table.
Well, yes and no. I mean, this process doesn't identify the floating device, but here's what would happen. If you get something in that process that is like a showstopper, that doesn't mean the Corps of Engineers just gets a get out of jail free card and doesn't have to do fish passage now. So that's going to kick you back over to something, some other plan B. And the other plan B could be a structure. I don't know what plan B would look like. So yeah, until we go through that really extensive process, we won't know which path we're really headed down.
Two thoughts.
Oh, we had this, I'll get you.
So hatchery funding for trout and steelhead being cut, I'm curious on that. It's a small number from my estimation, you know, what it costs out of those bazillion-dollar budgets you mentioned to continue that.
Yeah.
And then how are you guys gonna get water to the dam, the Lever Dam hatchery?
Okay, there's a lot there actually, and those were simple questions. So the funding, guys, and I'll say that specific to steelhead, understand what complicates that issue. What complicates that issue for the Corps is that we have to, just like the rest of our operations, one of our primary operations is what? Mitigation hatcheries. And so those have to be evaluated, and then they have their own set of actions that are associated with them. So for us, when there's either a perceived or a real impact associated with a program, that's something we have to address. And the question is then how, right? Ideally, you know, any of these programs we have will have as little impact on the wild fish species and listed fish species as possible. Sometimes there's good ways to do that with the program without cutting the program or making changes. In other cases, it's not always so clear, and so I think in the case of summer steelhead production, at the end of the day, we kind of looked at that and said, this is a tough one for us to justify with funding this program. Not that we want to get out of mitigation, but there's a history, a bit of a complicated history around that program. And that's not a fish was part of the original mitigation. It was a created program, popular program, good program. But so it did complicate that for us, and so I think we probably took an easier way out there to just say, hey, we're just not going to fund this. Jeff will agree. I don't see his hand. He doesn't raise his hand. I don't see any of you people. I saw another one out here. Let's move on.
I do want to clarify the summer steelhead program. The summer steelhead program was devised by taking hatchery rainbow trout and creating steelhead out of them. They're the same species. And so we took hatchery mitigation trout and made steelhead smolts out of them. And so what you're saying is not quite true, because they are mitigation fish. We could switch them back to rainbow trout again, and then increase the production of hatchery rainbow trout, and then try and find other state funds for a steelhead program if we want it. And so there are some complications there that I think everybody needs to take into account when we're making these tallies for mitigation.
I think we're saying the same thing.
So,
Fewer words from Zeller.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing. Who else? What else? Did you have a question? I don't want to.
I'm supporting Jeff.
Okay.
So-
He's my ride or die.
At the level that you're now keeping the reservoir so the fish can go out the regulated outlet, does that reduce the effectiveness of the cooling tower to adjust temperatures going out?
Sure. In general, at these reservoirs, the smaller the volume of water that you're working with, generally speaking, the higher really you'll see some of the fall temperatures end up being. That's complicated by a million other factors,
Right.
but that's just a way to generally think about it.
Because you don't have as much gradation.
Yeah,
The
and you
temperatures.
don't have as much cold water sitting there that sort
Right.
of
Yeah.
mitigates that effect
Right.
in the fall when the reservoir does turn over, is one way to think about it too. But, so there's that. The other thing that happens is it's a bit of a risky game to play to make sure that you actually accrue enough storage to be able to operate the tower the whole time. You can get burned. And the later you try to do the delayed refill, if you don't start storing water early enough and the tap turns off, you're going to get burned bad because you may not get up there at all. Or even if you do, you might be up there for such a short period of time that you can have some real detrimental temperature effects. Essentially, it'd be like the tower not being there. So that's the trick with all this is, and that's why I was kind of alluding to the timing of the South Fork being not as good because the fish coming in late complicates that. They don't benefit as long because at some point we're going to have to fill that reservoir or we're going to get burned on the downstream temps.
Okay.
So there's some tension there between those two things.
Greg, I was gonna ask that question a different way, and it was, does the drawdown, whether it's to the regulating openings or to the diversion tunnel, do those drawdowns essentially negate any value of the cooling towers?
If we end up using the diversion tunnel as the downstream passage and really the downstream water passage feature long-term, the cooling tower will sit there. It will sit there, do nothing.
$53 million down the tube.
Decimal dust, man.
Think how many pit tags you could have bought.
Decimal dust,
$53
man.
million.
Decimal dust, that's insignificant.
2 to 3 billion
Drowning
is what's being contemplated. No, I don't mean to make light of that. It is something that's, I mean, that's it's got to be weighed, right? Like, there's a downside to that. You made a big investment there, and so. But I think what people believe is the best chance to really pass the most juvenile fish downstream is to have this tiny little reservoir with very little depth intake. Those fish will pile out of that reservoir, and they're not piling out of there now.
Right.
So I think that's really gives you the best chance to be successful. It's got its complications,
Hey, Greg,
for sure.
I'm looking at this map, I think it came out of your report, and there's a penstock which drops the water from the face, or the base of the reservoir to the river level downstream. What is the penstock? And
The fish blenders, the turbine.
Oh, that's the turbine.
Yeah, it's a turbine.
That's the
And
money.
they didn't
yeah.
work.
Well, the turbines are hard on the fish,
Yeah.
and so
No, well, that's your power, yeah.
yeah, that's our power.
And are they disabled now, or?
No, we're using them. Other than there's certain small windows, right? So
Yeah.
during the injunction operation, I mentioned there was exclusive use of the RO.
Okay.
Now, even that has been modified because there are scenarios where you still need to use the turbine. But most of the year, we're using the turbine.
Yeah,
as
well,
the-
just looking at the schematic, it looks to me that would be the simple thing to divert the water into the penstock
When,
and get rid of the turbines.
okay, you brought that up, let's do it.
Well,
So,
I didn't, no, I don't, I'm done talking.
no, this is, so, the Water Resource Development Act language that is contemplating this notion of, hey, go back and evaluate the idea of limiting hydropower at the Willamette project. The reason that's attractive to people is, the belief is if we get rid of the hydro unit, then we've got a viable downstream passage route
Right.
ready-made.
And get rid of your little coffer dam there.
So what I'll point out is that, yes, holes in the dam are at a premium, so that's got inherent value because it's a hole in the dam. What's also true is you don't just put the hole in the dam and walk away and now we got good downstream fish passage. There is a tremendous amount of energy there that has to be dealt with
Yeah.
and stored, or dissipated, not stored, dissipated. My point is, there is a significant modification that would need to have to occur at a minimum to make those into fish passage routes. And that's not what's in people's heads. I think they think that it's, you take the unit out and we got fish passage. We do not. That would be the start of a process to get. And it will likely be very expensive, I'm guessing. And the intake is not necessarily that advantageous depending on the project because those are relatively deep intakes. So anyway, long conversation that society will have long before I'm gone, living in some tent out in the eastern Oregon.
I'll jump on mine. So the Weaver Dam hatchery, do you guys, just the core, are you guys required to get water to there? And then following, we have a short-term water problem and then we have a long-term water problem?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that one.
No.
Or I conveniently skipped it. So, if you go back and look at each facility, there are different requirements for each facility between the two entities that are involved with the facility. So in some cases, the water supply is, say, the Corps' responsibility. In some cases, it's ODFW's responsibility, and there's all kinds of differences. So the bottom line is, yeah, that particular facility water supply, is it? I don't think
60/40.
it's 60/40. So both entities have a stake in it. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I'm not even gonna pretend that I have some sort of answer to how we're gonna work that one. I think everybody thinks that it's gonna be important. We've been asked internally to kind of think about some things in a white paper to try to kind of get our arms around a whole bunch of things that, not just that, but it's not the only facility that's losing its water supply. So I think people we're at the point where we got to get serious about what needs to happen related to some. I don't know that facility always has to be there with that water supply. I don't know. I mean, but what I do know, we're gonna have a regional mitigation requirement that won't go away. We're gonna have a need to produce hatchery fish, period. Whether we use that, somehow get creative and come up with a water supply for that facility, or there's a increased production at other places, a brand new facility for regional scale comes online. I don't know what's going to happen.
Nope.
But the point is that requirement isn't going away, and the fish are gonna get produced some way, somehow. And maybe that happens at Leebird, maybe something else happens, I'm not sure. People will figure that out. We're not gonna just let Leebird go away and then just say, oh, well, that was convenient, I guess we don't have to fund that one anymore. That's not the answer.
Shouldn't go the way of steelhead then? Sorry.
It's a different, I'll call it a different situation. We're always gonna have some trout mitigation.
So jumping back to Cougar, you're producing power now. Is that going to the BPA?
Yeah, the BPA markets all the power
Okay.
that's produced at the core dams.
So in the case that we've had where BPA goes down, would it be possible to connect to Lane Electric's Blue River substation from Cougar?
Okay, and I'm way outside my comfort zone here. So what I know,
I thought it was possible in the past.
what I think I know, I'll say it that way, is that we have some ability to what we call internally, and I'm lost by all this, just to be fair, island certain things where we're able to backfeed power from a particular plant to a particular place and produce power for a localized location for some period of time while work is getting done on the primary. So an example that we do quite often is actually the city of Oak Ridge. So the city of Oak Ridge, Hills Creek will at times island the city of Oak Ridge and actually run the power for Oak Ridge for a day or two here or there while they're doing transmission work on some of the lines or whatever. We have that ability to a certain extent at Blue River. It's fairly limited though, and I don't fully understand it, to be fair. I will tell you that it's come up in the conversations around a scenario where you wouldn't be producing power, that is something that's lost. To be fair, I also don't believe it's happened very often at all. When I say that, it might be like 1 or 2 times ever, I believe.
That's what I
So,
think, yeah.
how big of a loss for the community would that be?
Nobody would want to run a hatchery that depended upon power to pump water, I would think.
That would be a very terrible idea, in my opinion,
Yeah.
based on other facilities I run with pumps.
What kind of a pool level would terminate power generation at Cougar? I thought you talked about that last year.
Yeah.
You get down to the 1,300 foot.
Yeah, so the normal minimum pool, winter pool, is 1532. We can produce power down to about 1516. It's only about 15 feet below that. There are scenarios where we can do it a little bit lower than that. So, but once you drop just that 20 or so feet, and this is true of almost all the projects, you can't produce power anymore. So you can't draw a pool down very far at all without getting into an elevation you just can't produce power. At Lookout, it's only 5 feet. Other places, it's further. All right, I took way too much of your time, but if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I thought Bonneville, a number of years ago, said, we don't want your power anymore.
They continue to tell us that.
Okay.
They don't want to be in this basin at all.
It's kind of like relicensing, isn't it?
So, I don't, well, I'll keep my personal opinions.
You never have.
That's a conversation, I know, and I get in trouble. I get myself in all kinds of trouble when I do that. So, I'm trying to keep myself out of trouble. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yeah.